When you step back and really look at how we generally approach ancient religious texts, there's this massive unspoken expectation of continuous magic.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very prevalent mindset.
Right. It reminds me a lot of how we interact with like a live service video game or even just modern cloud software.
That's a really interesting comparison.
Yeah, because if you're struggling with a level or, if your life hits a bug, the assumption is just that you can perform the right ritual, say the correct sequence of words, and the cosmic developer will just patch your life in real time.
Right, you get a customized miracle.
Exactly, a bespoke blessing just for you.
And that live service expectation is incredibly powerful because it offers, immediate comfort.
It feels good.
Right, we naturally gravitate toward this idea that the fundamental rules of the universe are malleable, that they can bend or pause or rewrite themselves if we just manage to figure out the right cheat code.
Or better yet, if we can find someone who has VIP access to the developer.
Precisely. Someone who can put in a good word for us.
But then, you step into the world of the specific historical analysis we're diving into today, and suddenly that entire live service model it's completely shut down.
Yeah, the server is closed to new inputs.
It's wild. We're looking at a spiritual and theological landscape that is honestly framed as a finalized, completely unchangeable operating system.
I think the terminology that fits best here is a locked protocol.
A locked protocol.
Yeah. The analysis we're exploring today argues for a system where the architect has essentially left the building.
Wow.
The work of designing the system is finished, the manual has been printed, and now the burden is, it's entirely on us to read that manual, understand the code, and build a societal infrastructure ourselves.
So there are no more patches coming.
No more patches.
I want to really unpack this with you today because it's a massive paradigm shift.
It really is.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're listening to this right now and you're someone who loves to learn, someone who dives into history, philosophy, theology, you've probably felt overwhelmed at some point by the sheer volume of mystical, esoteric, almost aggressively complex interpretations of ancient texts.
Oh, it can be incredibly daunting.
It really can. It often feels like you need a PhD in ancient languages, a crystal ball, and a dedicated spirit guide just to understand the basic instructions for being a decent human being.
And that overwhelming complexity you're describing, that's exactly what today's source material attempts to meticulously dismantle.
Right.
The text argues that the complexity isn't inherent to the original message at all. It's a layer of dust that has settled over centuries.
And that brings us to the core thematic hook for our conversation today. What if we've been looking at ancient religious texts, specifically, in this context, the Quran, completely wrong?
That's the big question.
What if, instead of viewing prophets as these mystical miracle workers handing out magic spells and intervening in our daily personal dramas, we viewed them more like, software architects?
I love that framing.
In this framework, they aren't here to do the heavy lifting for us. They aren't here to magically fix your broken relationships or cure a financial crisis.
Right.
They're here to deliver the protocol, the finalized, unalterable operating manual for human success.
And once that manual is delivered, the architect's job is done.
The code is compiled.
Exactly. The code is compiled, and the rest is entirely up to humanity.
Viewing theology through this radically pragmatic lens, it completely strips away the mystical middleman.
It does. And it demands a level of personal and collective accountability that is, frankly, quite terrifying.
To explore how this actually works, we're looking at a highly analytical, intensely fascinating lecture.
It's a brilliant piece of work.
It was delivered on October 26, 1960, by the religious thinker Ahmad Parwez. And he focuses his analysis specifically on a section of the Quran known as Surah 10, or Surah Yunus, specifically verses 64 through 69.
Yes, and this 1960 lecture, it operates as a surgical deconstruction of centuries of mystical tradition.
Surgical is the right word.
Parwez takes the original Arabic text and builds this really comprehensive argument that its core pragmatic message has been buried under layers of imported, man-made spiritual bureaucracy.
Now, before we jump into the deep end of this text, we need to make something very clear to you, the listener.
Good idea.
Our mission today is to unpack this specific 1960 lecture and explore its radical proposition. We're looking at how the speaker strips away what he defines as imported mysticism to reveal what he believes is a practical, socio-political, and evolutionary blueprint for humanity.
But there's a catch.
There is a catch. You should know that the source material contains some very strong, pointed theological critiques of various other belief systems.
It definitely doesn't pull any punches.
No, it doesn't. To make his point, the speaker directly critiques traditional Sufism, certain Christian concepts of original sin and salvation, and Hindu concepts of rebirth and karma.
The text is entirely unsparing in its philosophical comparisons. It uses those other traditions as contrasting foils to highlight its own arguments.
Because of that, as your guides through this material, we want to explicitly state our position. We are not taking sides.
Absolutely not.
We aren't endorsing these theological critiques, nor are we dismissing them. Our job is impartially mapping out the intellectual arguments presented in this specific 1960 lecture.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Exactly. The underlying logic, the historical context, and the sheer audacity of the argument are absolutely fascinating, regardless of your personal worldview or religious background.
We're here to look at the architecture of an idea.
So let's look at it. The architecture of this particular idea begins by attacking the very concept of spiritual hierarchy.
Which is such a foundational part of how humans operate.
It makes perfect sense to me why he'd start there. If the prophet or software architect is delivering a protocol that's meant for everyone, a manual for all of humanity, it raises a huge question.
Right.
Why does human history always, without fail, create a class of elites who claim they have special, exclusive access to the architect? We see it everywhere.
The human psychological drive to create hierarchies is immense. We just can't help ourselves. And the lecture begins by deeply examining how this drive warped a very specific Quranic term, which is Auliya Allah.
Auliya Allah. Now, if you read most traditional translations, or if you look at centuries of historical commentary and cultural practice, this term is almost always translated as friends of God, or more colloquially in English, saints.
Right, saints. And the cultural weight of that translation is enormous. Over centuries, a massive misconception formed around this word.
How so?
Well, the concept evolved to represent a separate, highly elite spiritual group. The prevailing idea became that an ordinary person, someone who goes to work, struggles with their bills, raises a family, and just tries to be a good person, can never truly reach the level of the Aliyah.
Right.
The Aliyah are seen as residing in a completely different sphere.
I love thinking of this as a spiritual VIP lounge.
That is the perfect analogy.
It's like you're at a massive club and you're stuck in the general admission area. The floors are sticky, the music is too loud, and you're just trying to get by.
You're just trying to survive the night.
Exactly. But the Aliyah, they're behind the velvet rope, they're sipping the expensive water, they have a direct line to the DJ, and if you want a request, if you need a prayer answered, you have to write it on a napkin and pass it to the bouncer, hoping they give it to the VIPs.
Yes. And that dynamic is precisely what the 1960 text is critiquing. Parwez asserts that this VIP concept, this velvet rope, is completely un-Quranic. Completely. He dives into the linguistic context of the original text to show that Auliya does not denote a separate class at all.
Wow.
According to the lecture, Auliya simply refers to all mu'minin, meaning believers, and all mujikin, meaning those who live righteously.
I want to make sure I'm really grasping the scale of this claim. The text is saying there is literally no velvet rope.
None whatsoever.
No inner circle.
The lecture insists there is absolutely no separate class of super-spiritual beings. If you believe in the protocol and you follow the rules of the protocol in your daily life, you are the Auliya.
That's amazing.
It's a collective noun for the entire community of followers. It is not a magical title reserved for a few individuals who meditate in caves.
That is incredibly democratizing. But it also makes me wonder about human nature.
In what way?
Well, if the original text is so relentlessly egalitarian, if it basically says, hey, everyone who follows the manual is part of the group, how did humanity manage to completely rewrite the rules?
That's the million-dollar question.
How did we manage to copy-paste earthly bureaucracy into the heavens? Because when you describe the traditional view of the Aliyah, it sounds like we just reinvented corporate middle management, but made it spiritual.
We absolutely did.
Yeah.
And the text provides a fascinating historical breakdown of how this earthly bureaucracy infected theology.
Okay, lay it on me.
Consider the structure of earthly governments, especially the medieval empires that existed during the centuries when these mystical traditions were solidifying. You have a king or an emperor at the top.
Right.
Below the king, you have a tier of governors. Below the governors, you have commissioners or regional deputies.
A strict, unyielding chain of command. A peasant doesn't just walk into the throne room to talk to the king.
Never.
They talk to the local tax collector, who talks to the magistrate, who talks to the governor.
Exactly. And what Parwez argues is that human beings, deeply influenced by esoteric and mystical thinkers, created a parallel spiritual government that perfectly mirrored this worldly bureaucracy.
A parallel government.
Yes. In this mystical hierarchy, which became highly prevalent in certain traditions, you have a supreme spiritual leader known as the Gauss.
The Gauss. So that's like the spiritual equivalent of the king or the prime minister.
Correct. And below the Gauss, the hierarchy states there are the Quadbi. Below them are the Abdal.
This is literally a shadow government.
A fully fleshed out shadow bureaucracy operating invisibly alongside the actual political world. And the lecture claims this entire framework was not derived from the original Islamic teachings of the Quran.
Where did it come from then?
Instead, it was an imported concept. The speaker traces its origins directly to the influence of Christian saint veneration and the Persian mystic traditions, often referred to collectively as tasawwuf.
So because we were so used to living under kings and governors in our political lives, when we were handed a direct open source protocol for our spiritual lives, we panicked.
We completely panicked.
We couldn't handle the direct access, so we wrapped it in a layer of spiritual middle management.
The psychological comfort of having a middleman really cannot be overstated. The text notes how these spiritual chains of command operate in practice. A disciple connects to a master. That master is connected to a higher, unseen master.
Right.
And this chain theoretically goes all the way up through history, connecting back to early foundational figures like the Caliph Ali or Abu Bakr. The lecture points out that this entirely fractures human existence.
Oh, so?
You end up with the worldly sphere governed by actual politicians and laws, and the spiritual sphere governed by these invisible saints.
And the really dangerous part, at least from the perspective of this 1960 lecture, is that these invisible saints are supposedly issuing decrees.
Right, they're managing the universe.
Exactly. Moving pieces on the cosmic board, while the ordinary person is just told to put their head down, pay their taxes, and blindly follow their local spiritual manager.
It creates a system of profound spiritual avoidance.
Yeah,
if the Auliya are viewed as a special class of superhumans who handle the heavy lifting of the universe, then an ordinary human is not expected to achieve their level of righteousness, bravery, or societal reform.
Oh, I see. You're off the hook.
Precisely. The ordinary person's only job is reverence. By dismantling this VIP lounge, Parwez is forcibly placing the burden of the protocol back onto the shoulders of every single individual.
Which is terrifying. It's so much easier to just pass a note to the bouncer.
It really is.
But if we strip away the mystical VIPs and we accept that there are no spiritual middlemen standing between humanity and the architect, it forces us to ask a mechanical question.
Okay.
How does humanity actually receive the protocol? And more importantly, what happens when the delivery of that manual is completely finished?
Okay. This moves the argument into the territory of Khatm-e-Nubuwwat, a concept that translates to the finality or the seal of prophethood.
Right, the foundational idea that Prophet Muhammad was the final messenger. But how does this specific lecture interpret the practical mechanics of that finality? Because that can mean a lot of different things.
The speaker analyzes the severe practical implications of that finality.
Yeah.
If prophethood is finalized, it means that direct divine communication, what is called why, or absolute revelation between God and humanity, is officially and permanently closed.
Permanently.
Yes. The manual is complete. The software is in version 1.0. The developer has locked the code, and there will never be a version 2.0.
But humans hate when a system is closed. We're hackers by nature.
We really are.
If we're told a system is locked, the very first thing we do is look for a loophole, a backdoor, and exploit something.
And the source material is acutely aware of that hacking instinct. The lecture notes that throughout history, people have constantly tried to find backdoors to this finalized code.
Give me an example.
Well, if they can no longer claim to be full prophets receiving new books because society would instantly reject that, they invent new terminology.
Rebranding.
Exactly. They claim they have kashif, which translates to unveilings or visions. They claim ilham, which is private divine inspiration. And most commonly, they claim mubashirat, which refers to prophetic, divinely inspired dreams.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here, because admitting my own bias, aren't dreams a completely universal human experience?
Of course they are.
Everyone dreams. Sometimes you have a dream that feels incredibly profound, or it helps you solve a complex emotional problem, or gives you a sense of peace about a deceased loved one.
Absolutely.
So why is the author of this 1960 text so fiercely, almost aggressively opposed to finding spiritual meaning in dreams? Is he just anti-imagination?
No, the critique is not about denying that dreams occur or that they possess deep psychological significance for the individual.
Okay.
The text's core argument is entirely about authority and jurisdiction. Elevating a personal dream, vision, or inspiration to the level of divine guidance essentially breaks the seal of prophethood.
Break that down for me.
The logic is straightforward. If the protocol is finalized in a public, objective written book, everyone knows the rules. The laws are visible.
Right.
But if society believes that God is still issuing edicts or new rules through the private dreams of local holy men, the finalized protocol instantly becomes obsolete.
Because now the rules can change on a random Tuesday just because Gary down the street had a weird dream after eating spicy food.
Exactly. The objective law is replaced by subjective feelings.
It creates a chaotic, ungovernable system. If a mystic can stand up and say, the book says X, but I had a powerful vision last night that God wants our community to do Y, and the society accepts visions as valid divine currency, the book is dead.
It's completely dead.
Hmm.
The written code is effectively overwritten by a private experience that no one else can verify.
There is a brilliant analogy in the text for this exact danger, isn't there? The train track analogy. I want to really dig into this because it visualizes the argument perfectly.
The train track analogy is one of the most effective rhetorical tools in the lecture. Parwez says that treating personal dreams or visions as if they hold the weight of revelation is like a train changing tracks at a switch point.
Okay, picture a train track.
Right. At the exact millisecond the train hits the switch, the physical difference between the original track and the new track is only about 1 inch.
It's tiny.
It seems completely negligible. A believer might think, what is the harm in giving a little bit of divine weight to this holy man's dream?
Yeah.
It doesn't contradict the book that much. It's just a 1-inch compromise.
It feels like a harmless add-on, just a little flavor text for the community.
But the analogy continues. That 1-inch divergence changes the trajectory. 10 miles down the line, the tracks are hundreds of yards apart.
Oh, wow.
100 miles down the line, the train is heading to a completely different destination, a completely different city, entirely out of sight of the original path.
That makes so much sense.
Once a society accepts that divine communication is still open via dreams, they've switched tracks. Over generations, they will eventually abandon the original text altogether, and their entire religious life will be governed by the whims of whoever claims to have the most vivid, authoritative visions.
And to prove that this isn't just a theoretical anxiety, the text uses a historical anchor that is just fascinating. It doesn't just point to random mystics. It points to the Prophet Muhammad's own dream.
This is arguably the strongest piece of evidence the lecture deploys.
I couldn't agree more.
The text recounts a highly significant historical event where the Prophet Muhammad had a dream. In this dream, he and his followers were entering Mecca peacefully to perform the Hajj pilgrimage.
And we have to set the scene here to understand the emotional weight of this.
Right, the context is everything.
At this time, the Prophet and his followers were exiled in Medina. Mecca was controlled by their hostile enemies. They had been driven from their homes. So a dream about returning to Mecca for the most sacred ritual wasn't just a casual thought.
Not at all.
It was the ultimate, desperate hope of an exiled community.
The stakes were astronomical. And based on the profound nature of this dream, the Prophet prepared his followers. Thousands of them mobilized and began the long, dangerous march toward Mecca, fully expecting the dream to be realized.
Because it's the Prophet's dream. Of course it's going to happen.
That was the assumption. However, the reality on the ground did not match the vision. They were intercepted by their enemies at a location called Hudaybiyah.
A massive, tense standoff.
A huge standoff ensued. Ultimately, to avoid a bloodbath, a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
And the terms of that treaty were devastating for the morale of the followers at the time.
They were. The most crucial outcome of the treaty, for the purpose of this lecture's argument, was that the Muslims had to turn back. They were not allowed to enter Mecca.
So they didn't do the Hajj.
They did not perform the Hajj that year. They had to pack up and go back to Medina in exile.
So the dream, the Prophet's own vivid dream, did not come true.
The dream was not fulfilled. And this is the absolute crux of Parwez's argument. He argues that this historical event definitively proves that even a prophet's dream is not an absolute divine decree.
Wow.
It is not wayway or revelation. The logic is ironclad. If that dream had been an official addendum to the protocol, if it had been the absolute, unbreakable will of the architect, it would have been fulfilled immediately, without fail.
Because God doesn't get stopped at a border.
Exactly. God's finalized revelation does not get turned back at a checkpoint by human enemies.
So by pointing out that the prophet's own dream was just a dream, a reflection of his deep human desire to return to his homeland rather than a cosmic command, the text is making a devastating point about the rest of us.
It really is.
It's saying if the architect's own dream wasn't a software update, your local mystic's dream definitely isn't. Building a societal framework on anyone's dreams is fundamentally structurally flawed.
It permanently shuts the back door. The manual is the manual. Your dreams, no matter how beautiful or inspiring, are just your dreams. They belong to the realm of human psychology, not divine law.
This brings up a massive practical question, though.
Okay, what is it?
Well, if we cannot rely on mystical dreams for guidance, and if we cannot outsource our problems to the VIP saints in the spiritual lounge, what is the actual, tangible result of following this rigid protocol?
That's a fair question.
The lecture points to a specific promise in the text, Surah 10, verse 62. This verse promises that the Auliya, which we now know means all true believers who follow the manual, will have no fear upon them, nor will they grieve. But without magic, how is that practically achieved? How do you conquer fear and grief with just a manual?
To understand the text's answer, we first have to understand the view it is rejecting.
Okay, what's the rejected view?
The traditional mystic view of conquering fear is deeply internalized and passive. The idea is that escaping fear means retreating from the world. You sit in a corner, you detach yourself from material desires, and you enter a state of deep meditation where you become oblivious to your physical surroundings.
Right.
The text actually uses a somewhat humorous image,
Yeah.
noting the mystic ideal of being so detached from reality that you don't even notice if people are actively throwing stones at you.
The classic image of the ascetic on the mountain. I am so perfectly zen that poverty, disease, and political oppression simply bounce off my aura. My body might be starving, but my soul feels no fear.
Exactly. And the 1960 lecture completely and utterly rejects this internalized definition of fearlessness.
What does it replace it with?
Parwez argues that true freedom from fear and grief only comes through two very specific, very active concepts. Istiqlal fil ard, which means establishment or inheritance of the earth, and Tamkeen, which translates to power, sovereignty, or a firm, unshakable grounding in society.
Let me reframe this in modern terms, because I think this is where the 1960 lecture speaks directly to you, the listener, right now in the present day.
Oh, absolutely.
We live in a society with sky-high rates of anxiety, economic fear, and political dread. The mystical, purely internalized approach is basically the equivalent of giving everyone in a collapsing economy a meditation app.
A meditation app. That's so accurate.
The advice is, breathe in, breathe out, ignore the fact that you can't afford rent, ignore the corrupt institutions, just find your inner peace.
It places the burden of enduring a broken system entirely on the individual's mental state.
Exactly. But what this text is arguing is that you do not cure a society's anxiety with a meditation app.
Yeah.
You cannot meditate your way out of systemic oppression.
No, you can't.
You cure fear by fixing the economy. You cure it by reforming the justice system. You cure it by building a secure, transparent political infrastructure.
The source material is arguing that fear is eradicated by establishing a secure, just, socio-political system based on the objective, divine laws of the protocol. The promise of no fear is a collective, earthly, highly tangible reality. It is not an internal psychological state achieved in isolation.
But how does the protocol actually do that? How does a manual cure fear?
By enforcing universal laws that remove the sources of arbitrary fear.
Arbitrary fear.
Yeah. If the protocol dictates that justice must be impartial, that wealth must circulate rather than be hoarded, and that leadership is a matter of administrative duty rather than divine right, it systematically dismantles the mechanisms of tyranny.
Oh, I see.
You are fearless because you live in a society where your basic human rights are structurally protected, where justice is swift and fair, and where you are not subject to the arbitrary, unpredictable whims of kings, dictators, or even fake spiritual masters.
It's the difference between feeling safe because you took a heavy tranquilizer and feeling safe because your house has a solid foundation, strong locks, and you live in a peaceful, well-lit neighborhood. The tranquility isn't chemical, it's structural.
Parwez highlights the hypocrisy of the internalized mystic view with a highly specific historical anecdote. It's a biting critique drawn from the British colonial era in India, which would have been very resonant for his audience in 1960.
The story of the British pensioners. This is where the lecture stops being purely theoretical and throws a serious punch.
The speaker critiques certain self-proclaimed spiritual visionaries who lived and operated under British colonial rule. These are men who claim to be receiving those mubashrat, the glad tidings and divine dreams we discussed earlier.
Right.
They gave themselves grand cosmic spiritual titles. They told their thousands of followers that they were under the direct protection of God, that they were the masters of the unseen world, completely free from any worldly fear.
The ultimate VIPs, they claim to have the cheat codes for the universe.
However, the text points out a glaring contradiction in the historical records.
What's the contradiction?
When you look at the archives, these same supposedly fearless cosmic mystics were writing groveling, highly subservient petitions to the British Lieutenant Governor.
You're kidding.
No, they were actively begging the colonial empire for physical protection against their local rivals or sectarian opponents.
It is such a devastating image. You have a man sitting on a rug telling his followers, I am the spiritual master of this age. The angels themselves answer to my commands. But also, please, Mr. British Governor, could you send an armed constable to my house because my neighbors are threatening me?
The lecture mocks this relentless contradiction. How can you possibly claim the Quranic promise of no fear upon them while you are literally shaking in your boots, relying on the guns of an occupying colonial empire for your physical safety?
The cognitive dissonance is just staggering.
The text uses this historical embarrassment to prove that real fearlessness requires real systemic independence and sovereignty. That is Tamkeen. You cannot be a spiritual giant while existing as a political and social dependent. The protocol is meant to build a civilization that stands on its own feet, capable of defending itself and providing for its citizens, not a group of isolated hermits hiding from the world and begging empires for scraps of safety.
This realization brings us to a massive pivot in the conversation. This is the deepest philosophical difference explored in the entire lecture.
It really shifts the whole perspective.
If the goal isn't just to hide in a cave and meditate, and if the goal is actually to build this fearless, robust, self-sustaining society, what is the ultimate endpoint? Why are we doing all this? What is the final destination of human existence according to this rigid protocol?
To answer that question, the text first breaks down the traditional concept of salvation. It examines how other major worldviews define the ultimate goal of humanity, using them as a backdrop to offer its own radical alternative.
Let's walk through those traditional definitions as the text presents them. I think understanding the contrast is vital.
The lecture looks at the concept of najat, or mukti words, commonly translated as salvation.
Oh.
It first examines the text's understanding of the Christian concept.
Okay.
It explains the doctrine of original sin, the theological idea that humanity is born with an inherent burden, a spiritual debt inherited from the first humans.
Right.
Because of this initial failing, every single human starts their existence in a negative deficit. Jesus is then sent as a divine sacrifice to pay that insurmountable debt, to take on the punishment on humanity's behalf.
So what's the goal?
Therefore, the ultimate goal of the believer is to be saved from this inherent pit, to have the debt wiped clean so they can return to a state of grace.
Okay, so in that framework, life starts in the red. You owe a debt you didn't personally accrue, and salvation is the process of bringing your account balance back to zero. What about the other worldview the lecture mentions?
It then analyzes the Hindu or Vedantic concept of salvation. Here, the focus is on the cycle of rebirths, the chakra.
Right, reincarnate.
The underlying idea is that the individual soul, the Atma, was originally part of the universal soul, the Paramatma. But at some point, it became separated and fell into the physical material world.
Okay.
By interacting with the material world, the soul gets dirty, acquiring karma. The goal of existence, which is achieved through multiple grueling cycles of rebirth, is to slowly wash off this material dirt. Eventually, once you are clean enough, you reunite with the original source, merging back into the universal soul and losing individual identity.
So if we look at both of those standard definitions of salvation, getting out of a massive debt or washing off lifetimes of accumulated dirt, they both seem to operate on the premise that human existence is basically a cleanup operation.
A cleanup operation, exactly.
You make a mess or you inherit a mess and your only job is to clean it up. What is the 1960 text's alternative to this?
The alternative is a concept the text calls Fawzul Azim, which translates roughly to the supreme achievement or the great triumph. Parwez forcefully argues that the Quranic protocol does not view humans as being born in sin, nor does it view us as being born covered in material dirt. We do not start in the red.
So we start exactly at zero, a blank slate,
We start with raw, untapped potential. The text argues that returning to a blank slate, just getting back to as you were before the dirt or the sin, defeats the entire magnificent purpose of creation.
How so?
If the architect created this incredibly complex, mathematically precise universe, why would the ultimate goal for humanity be to spend its entire existence just trying to get back to the starting line?
This is where the lecture deploys two analogies that I think are just absolutely brilliant: the laundry and the sanatorium.
They are vivid, deeply relatable metaphors. The text compares the traditional cleanup view of salvation to sending a dirty cloth to the laundry.
Okay, a dirty cloth?
The cloth is stained. It goes through a rough, turbulent washing process. But what is the ultimate victory for the cloth? It just becomes white again. It is exactly the same piece of fabric it was before it got dirty. It hasn't evolved. It has just been restored.
The sanatorium analogy hits even harder, I think.
It does. The text compares traditional salvation to a sick person going to a sanatorium or a hospital. You go to the hospital because you've contracted a disease. You suffer through the treatments, and if you're lucky, you're cured.
Right.
But your ultimate victory in the hospital is just returning to your baseline health. You walk out the doors, and you aren't suddenly a superhuman athlete with new abilities. You're just not sick anymore.
You're just back to being a regular, fragile human. You survived, but you didn't level up.
Exactly.
How?
Parwez argues that life, according to the protocol, is not about returning to zero. It is not about escaping a deficit. It is about Urtica evolution.
Evolution. And we aren't just talking about Darwinian biological evolution here, right? We're talking about cosmic, spiritual, and intellectual evolution, the expansion of human capacity.
We are. The text traces the concept of life from its absolute origins. It describes life starting as a microscopic single cell in the primordial muck, developing, striving, and growing over unimaginable eons into complex humanity.
The forward momentum.
The fundamental, undeniable characteristic of life is continuous forward momentum. The goal of existence is not to wash off dirt. It is to grow into something entirely new, something higher and more capable.
I am fascinated by how this paradigm shift completely redefines the concepts of heaven and hell. Because in the traditional sanatorium view, heaven is essentially the discharge lounge.
The discharge lounge.
Yeah, you get there, you put on a clean white robe, you sit on a soft cloud, and you just relax for eternity. You've beaten the disease of life, and now you get to rest forever.
That passive vision of eternity is exactly what the text rejects. In this evolutionary paradigm, hell, referred to in the text as Jahannam or Jahim, is described not merely as a medieval torture chamber of fire and brimstone.
What is it then?
It is defined as a stoppage of growth. It is absolute stagnation. The linguistic root of the concept implies being halted, being completely unable to evolve further. You have failed to develop the capacity during your earthly life to handle the next stage of existence, so you are stuck.
Hell is peaking in high school and never growing as a person, but applied on a terrifying cosmic scale. It's the horror of realizing you can no longer learn or change.
That is a painfully accurate modern translation of the concept. The torment is the stagnation itself. And conversely, Heaven Jannah is not a final resting place where you sit around passively playing harps.
Right.
It is the thrilling continuation of the evolutionary journey. The text highlights the use of the word marij, which translates to climbing new stairs or stages of ascent.
Heaven is a staircase.
Heaven is having successfully developed the spiritual and intellectual capacity in this life to continue growing in the next. It is the ability to explore higher realms of existence, to face new, unimaginable horizons, and to continue the process of Irtika forever.
I love that concept so much. Heaven is not a hammock, it's a staircase. It changes absolutely everything about how you view your daily actions, your struggles, and your failures.
It really does.
You aren't just trying to avoid making mistakes so you don't get a demerit on your cosmic report card. You are actively trying to build the spiritual, moral, and intellectual muscles required to climb the next set of stairs. If you don't build the muscle here, you won't be able to climb there.
It demands an active, continuous pursuit of achievement fawzul azim, rather than a passive wait for salvation.
Which brings us to the final massive hurdle. If the universe is built on this beautiful, continuous evolutionary protocol, and if our ultimate goal is to build a fearless society so we can focus on climbing this cosmic staircase, why is human history just one long, depressing record of us failing to do this?
It's a fair point to bring up.
Why do we constantly fall for false authorities, brutal dictators, and the propaganda of empires that try to halt our progress and keep us in fear?
The lecture anticipates this exact frustration. It moves to analyze verse 10.65 of the Quran, which reads, "Let not their speech grieve you. Indeed, all power Izzat belongs to Allah."
Okay.
Parwez unpacks this specific verse to explain the psychology of human fear in the face of worldly power.
Let not their speech grieve you. That phrasing sounds exactly like a warning about dealing with propaganda.
It is entirely about propaganda and psychological warfare. Human beings, because of our limited perspective, are easily terrified by the massive scale of earthly empires and worldly powers.
Sure.
The text specifically references the historical context of the ancient empires, like the Byzantine and Roman empires. These were massive, seemingly invincible superpowers of their day. They controlled the known world.
Right, they were everything.
When you are a small group of believers trying to implement a new egalitarian protocol, the sheer volume of propaganda from these empires, their massive standing armies, their unimaginable wealth, their grandiose titles, is designed to make you grieve. It is designed to make you feel utterly hopeless, tiny, and insignificant.
It's a feeling we still have today. It's the feeling you get when you try to change a local unjust law in your town, and you suddenly come up against a multi-billion-dollar corporate lobbying group with armies of lawyers and PR firms.
Yep.
You just feel tiny. You feel like they hold all the cards and your little manual of rules means nothing.
And this feeling of being tiny, this intimidation, leads people to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of true power. The source analyzes why ancient empires, and human societies in general, invented the concept of God having a son or having divine deputies on earth to manage things.
Let me try an analogy here. If you look at aging monarchs in history, or even fragile CEOs of massive modern tech companies, they always feel this desperate need to publicly name an heir.
They do.
They need a deputy, a crown prince, a hand-picked successor. Why? They do it to prove to the shareholders or the peasants that the system won't collapse when they inevitably die or fail. It is actually a projection of extreme fragility. True stability doesn't need to constantly parade its backup plan.
That psychological mechanism is precisely what the lecture exposes. Parwez argues that human rulers project their own mortal weaknesses onto their concept of the divine.
Ah, I see.
Because human empires are fragile, because kings die of disease, because supply chains break down, humans imagine that God must also need sons, deputies, or an elite class of saints to help manage the vastness of the universe. They assume God's governance looks like Roman governance, reliant on delegates because the center cannot hold.
It's political anthropomorphism. We think God has a cabinet of ministers because our prime minister has a cabinet.
Exactly. But the text argues that the true God, the architect of the universe and the protocol, has absolutely no need for deputies. True power does not share authority because it does not suffer from fragility or fatigue.
And to prove where real unshakable power lies, the text doesn't point to human history. It points away from human empires entirely and points toward the physical universe.
The solar system analogy is the grand climax of this argument.
I love this part.
The text asks the listener to look up. Look at the massive sun, the earth, the relentless alternation of night and day. Look at the sheer gargantuan scale of these celestial bodies.
It's mind-boggling.
They follow their prescribed orbits flawlessly. They do not miss a fraction of a second over millions of years. They operate with a precision that defies human comprehension.
They don't take bribes. They don't need a deputy sun to take over the orbit on the weekends because the main sun is tired.
Exactly. That flawless, unbreakable, majestic adherence to the cosmic law that is true that is real power and absolute control.
Wow.
By comparison, the lecture argues, the false authorities that humans invent to terrify each other, the idols of stone, the fragile empires of men, the fake saints sitting in their mystical VIP lounges, they are all just phantoms. The text says they will melt like snow in the sun when faced with the reality of the architect's true power.
So when the verse says all power belongs to Allah, it is not just a religious platitude to make you feel better. It is a harsh reality check.
It really is.
It's saying stop being terrified by the Roman army's PR department. Stop letting corporate lobbying groups convince you they own the world. Look at Jupiter. Look at the mass of the sun. The physical laws that run those planets with absolute terrifying precision are the exact same laws running this protocol.
That realization leads to the text's final grounding reminder. The lecture concludes by emphasizing the phrase, "There is no changing the words of Allah."
The locked protocol.
The protocol is set. It does not yield to human anxiety. It does not alter its moral code to appease a powerful dictator. And it does not rewrite its fundamental laws because a mystic had a really convincing dream.
Right.
The manual is perfectly stable, and that objective stability is the only true foundation for building a fearless society.
Wow. Okay, let's try to wrap up this incredible journey. We've taken a deep dive into an October 1960 lecture that completely flips the script on how we view ancient sacred texts.
It really turns everything on its head.
The speaker, Ahmad Parwez, systematically dismantled the idea of a mystical VIP elite. He rejected the human urge to find backdoors and cheat codes through dreams, insisting that the manual is locked and finalized.
Yes.
He completely redefined the concept of conquering fear, moving it from hiding in a cave to actively building a just, robust socio-political system. And perhaps most profoundly of all, he swapped out the depressing goal of just washing off sin in a cosmic sanatorium for a thrilling, demanding vision of continuous cosmic evolution.
The overarching theme binding all of these points together is absolute accountability. The prophet wasn't a magician sent here to fix our daily mistakes. He was the master architect giving us the compiled code, the protocol, to build our own future.
Which brings this entire massive philosophical shift right back to you, the listener. It is so easy to look at history and laugh at people relying on dreams, or to mock those so-called spiritual giants begging colonial governors for protection.
It's very easy to judge.
But how often do we do the exact same thing today? How often do we look for a quick fix, a charismatic self-help guru, a miracle diet, or a loud political savior to solve our systemic problems, instead of doing the hard, unglamorous daily work of following a proven, disciplined system?
We still deeply crave the live service patch. We still want the architect to log back in and fix the bugs in our personal lives.
But the protocol is finalized. The tools are already in your hands. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
If the ultimate goal of your existence isn't to get back to a state of innocent, blank slate purity, if life isn't just a hospital trying to cure you of being human, but rather a grand staircase asking you to evolve into something entirely new, what is the next step in your personal evolution? Are you spending your energy just trying to get back to normal, or are you willing to look at the manual, step out of the sanatorium, and grow into the unknown?
A staircase is much harder to climb than a hospital bed is to sleep in.
But the view from the top is worth the climb. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.